Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we're going to be taking a look at Indigenous sustainability practices.
Oh, absolutely, and I'm excited to get into it.
Yeah, this is going to be a good one. So we're taking a look at Chapter 3 of Indigenous Wisdom for Sustainable Futures. And we're going to see all these fascinating ways that Indigenous communities live in harmony with the environment.
It's really a different way of looking at the world. You know, when we're talking about Indigenous sustainability practices, we're talking about a worldview that sees everything as interconnected. So humans, animals, plants, water, the soil, it's all one big system working together.
Yeah, it's a really powerful way to think about it.
Right.
And I think it makes so much sense when you think about trying to live sustainably.
Yeah.
So let's start with the basics here.
Okay.
The foundation of any thriving community is going to be healthy soil and reliable water. So Chapter 3, dives deep into how Indigenous communities make sure they've got these essentials.
And it's amazing how many different approaches there are. I mean, you look at the Zai technique in West Africa, for example, talk about maximizing limited resources in arid regions.
Yeah.
So they dig these pits and they concentrate water and nutrients in those pits, and it basically helps the land make the most of what it has.
So this is not just about conserving water, but it's about using it strategically to boost the land's natural productivity.
Exactly. And that's a key part of Indigenous practices. I mean, a lot of it is working with those natural processes that are already there, like maximizing efficiency and, especially in these areas where there are limited resources.
Right.
Another really cool example that shows this partnership with nature is the Subak system in Bali.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that.
Yeah, this is a centuries-old irrigation system for rice paddies, and the whole thing is managed by the community.
What makes it so special, though? Is it just about getting the water to the rice efficiently?
No, it's way more than that. This system is actually designed to maintain the entire ecosystem. So it balances the water needs of those rice paddies with the surrounding environment, to make sure that agriculture and nature can coexist.
It's really incredible.
Yeah.
It really sounds like living with nature, not against it.
Exactly.
And this seems to be a theme, throughout Chapter 3. It talks about regenerative practices that actually improve the environment.
Right.
Not just sustaining it.
Yeah.
So, what does that look like?
Well, it's all about revitalizing the soil. Embracing diversity and working with nature's intelligence.
Okay.
And in practice, that means minimizing soil disturbance, keeping living roots in the ground year-round, focusing on natural pest control. So it's all about creating this closed-loop system where everything benefits.
So it's not just about taking from the land. It's about actually giving back and making it healthier.
Exactly.
Do you have an example that really brings this to life?
Oh, yeah. The Milpa system in Mesoamerica, that's a great one. So they plant maize, beans, and squash together.
Oh, the three sisters.
Exactly. And this polyculture system really mimics the natural interdependence you see in ecosystems.
So it's more than just planting, a few different crops in the same spot.
Oh, yeah, way more. There's this sophisticated understanding of how these plants work together. Like the maize provides support for the beans to climb. The beans, they fix nitrogen in the soil, so they're enriching it for all three plants.
Wow.
And then the squash, it spreads out on the ground, suppresses weeds, helps retain moisture.
So each plant is contributing to the others.
Exactly. And it's all about recognizing those connections and using them to create a thriving system.
Now, this kind of reminds me of permaculture.
Absolutely. Permaculture takes a lot of inspiration from this indigenous wisdom.
Okay.
And, it uses those same regenerative principles, but designs highly efficient and self-sufficient food production systems. And it's all about those closed loops, too. Like waste becomes a resource.
I like that. So can you give me an example of how permaculture kind of borrows from these indigenous practices?
Sure. Like water management. Permaculture often uses techniques like swales, which are these ditches that capture and slow down rainwater. And that's directly inspired by traditional water harvesting methods that indigenous communities have used for centuries.
So it's like ancient wisdom with a modern twist.
You got it.
Now, speaking of ingenuity, Chapter 3 also gets into sustainable energy production.
Right.
How did these communities meet their energy needs before, modern technologies?
They were masters at harnessing the power of nature, Like passive solar design, for instance. They would build structures to capture the sun's energy for warmth.
Okay.
They would use thick adobe walls for insulation,
Yeah.
keeping the inside cool during the day and warm at night.
So it's all about working with the environment's natural rhythms and using readily available materials.
Exactly. And they didn't just stop at solar, they harnessed wind power too.
Oh, wow.
Think like traditional windmills placed to catch the wind and do things like pump water. And even today, you see indigenous communities adapting this knowledge and using wind turbines to generate electricity.
It's amazing how they understood their local environments and how to work with these natural resources.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible.
Now, what about energy sources like wood? I mean, wouldn't that lead to deforestation?
Well, that's where their sustainable practices come in.
Right.
They used biomass, but in a way that minimized pollution and protected forests.
Yeah.
So they developed improved cook stoves that burn fuel more efficiently. So you need less firewood and there's less smoke. And even today, they're adopting innovations like biogas systems,
Oh, wow.
capturing methane from organic waste,
Wow.
and creating a clean and renewable energy source.
So it's not just about what energy you're using, but how you're using it.
Right.
That's really cool. Now, thinking about the structures themselves, the buildings in these different climates.
Yeah.
I mean, were they designed with sustainability in mind too?
Oh, absolutely. Indigenous architecture is all about working with the environment. We talked about adobe in the desert, but in the rainforest, you might see homes built on stilts, elevated to catch the breeze and avoid floods.
Oh.
It's all about adapting to those specific challenges.
So what are some examples that really show how effective these designs can be?
Well, the Navajo Nation in the American Southwest is a great example.
Oh.
They've been leading the way with solar projects,
Really?
combining that ancient knowledge of working with the sun with modern technology. And it's a step towards energy independence and environmental responsibility.
It's this really fascinating blend of tradition and innovation.
Yeah.
Do any other examples come to mind?
Oh, sure. Traditional Bhutanese architecture. These structures are built from local materials, and they're so cleverly designed to stay warm or cool naturally,
Wow.
really showcasing that sustainability can be both practical and beautiful.
They're like works of art.
They really are.
So it's not about rejecting modern technology. It's about using it in a way that aligns with traditional wisdom and respects the natural world. That's great. And, that leads us perfectly into our next topic, which is agroforestry and tree management across climates.
Right, because indigenous communities understand that trees are so much more than just a source of wood.
Right.
They're essential for a thriving ecosystem.
So we're going to dive into that in part 2 of our deep dive. We'll explore how indigenous communities around the world have integrated trees into their landscapes and their lives in a way that benefits everyone.
So we were talking about trees and how indigenous communities have really integrated them into their lives.
Yeah, agroforestry, chapter 3 dives into that, and it seems like it's a central practice in so many cultures.
Oh, yeah. It's everywhere, but it looks different, depending on where you are.
Right.
In tropical rainforests, for example, you see these really complex, multi-layered systems, almost like they're mimicking the natural forests around them.
So it's like they're creating these like mini forests within their living spaces.
Exactly. You might have a home garden with fruit trees, medicinal plants, and even small livestock, all mixed together, making the most of the space, creating this thriving little ecosystem.
It's really cool. What about more temperate regions? What does it look like there?
There, they might integrate fruit and nut trees into their fields alongside crops and livestock. It's like a beautiful mosaic, and it's good for the land and the people.
It shows that these practices aren't just about subsistence.
Yeah.
They can be economically viable too.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
What about arid regions, though, where trees are scarce? How do they do agroforestry in a place like that?
Even in those tough environments, they've found ways to make it work.
Okay.
Indigenous communities plant drought-resistant trees strategically, for shade wind protection.
Right.
It helps combat desertification and creates these little microclimates.
I'd love to hear some concrete examples. What are some of the most impressive agroforestry systems you've come across?
Oh, man, there's so many. But the Chaga people's home gardens on Mount Kilimanjaro are pretty amazing. They've got this system that produces so much food in a small space, and it provides habitat for wildlife and keeps the soil healthy.
It's like a permaculture paradise.
Exactly.
It's amazing how they've adapted to those mountainside conditions.
It really is. Another cool example is the Dehisas of Spain.
I don't think I've heard of that.
So picture these landscapes where livestock are grazing among oak trees,
Okay.
and they produce both meat and cork.
Wow.
It shows you can have human needs and environmental protection.
You don't have to choose one or the other.
Exactly.
So now chapter 3 also talks about animal husbandry. And it seems like for indigenous communities, it's more than just raising livestock.
Yeah, it's about a connection with those animals and the land they graze on.
Oh,
Respecting them as part of this larger system.
right.
And ensuring their well-being.
Practices like rotational grazing and nomadic pastoralism probably play a big role.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Can you break those down for our listeners who might not know what they are?
Sure. So rotational grazing is all about preventing overgrazing.
Okay.
You divide the pasture into sections and move the animals between them. It gives the vegetation time to recover.
So it's like mimicking the natural movements of herds.
Right. And then nomadic pastoralism takes it a step further.
Okay.
Entire communities migrate with their herds across vast distances,
Wow.
following the seasons and the grazing lands.
That takes a deep understanding of the land.
It really does.
So what are some other key principles in indigenous animal husbandry?
Well, a lot of communities practice selective breeding,
Okay.
focusing on traits like disease resistance and adaptability to local conditions. So you end up with these hardy animals that are perfectly suited to their environment.
And they're really resilient.
Exactly. And there's a big emphasis on ethical treatment, too.
Yeah.
Using natural remedies and taking a holistic approach.
So they're drawing on generations of traditional knowledge.
Absolutely.
What are some of the most compelling examples of this in action?
The Maasai people of East Africa come to mind.
Oh, yeah. The Maasais are incredible.
Yeah. They've been managing those vast herds on the savanna for centuries.
It's more than a livelihood for them.
It is. Cattle are central to their culture and their identity.
It's so interesting how these practices are tied to their cultural heritage.
Absolutely. And another fascinating example is camelid husbandry in the Andes.
Oh, yeah. Llamas and alpacas.
Right. They raise them for wool meat and even transport.
Wow.
And their manure is great fertilizer for the crops.
It's a really integrated system.
Yeah, it is. And it shows how much they understand that interconnectedness of everything. The animals, the plants, the land, and the people.
Yeah. It's a valuable lesson for all of us as we try to create more sustainable systems.
Couldn't agree more. And that brings us to the next part of our conversation.
In part 3 of our deep dive, we'll explore how indigenous knowledge is being combined with modern science to create some really innovative solutions. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive. We've seen how indigenous communities manage soil and water, work with trees, and care for their animals.
It's really remarkable.
In a way that's like truly in harmony with nature.
Yeah, and what's really exciting is that this wisdom isn't stuck in the past.
Right.
It's being woven together with modern science to come up with all these innovative solutions.
That's what I'm really curious about. Chapter 3 talks about this integration, but before we get into the examples, could you talk about why this collaboration is so important?
It's about recognizing that both knowledge systems, both indigenous knowledge and science have their own strengths.
Yeah.
Like indigenous knowledge comes from generations of experience, right? And this deep understanding of how everything's connected.
Right.
And then science, it brings its rigorous methodologies and all these tools for analysis.
Yeah.
So when you bring those two together, you can create solutions that are effective, but also respectful of those cultural values.
So it's not about replacing one with the other.
No, not at all.
It's about like weaving them together.
Exactly. It's all about finding that synergy where tradition and innovation can work together.
Okay, so what are some examples of how this is playing out in real life?
Oh, there are so many cool projects happening, like in soil management, for instance.
Okay.
Scientists are working with indigenous communities to study and revitalize traditional practices like making biochar.
Now, what is biochar?
Oh, yeah. It's this charcoal-like material you get by burning organic matter in a low-oxygen environment.
Right.
And indigenous communities have been using it for ages to improve the soil. And now scientists are using their tools to analyze how it works and, how to optimize its production.
Right.
Because biochar is really good for carbon sequestration, too.
Oh, wow. So they're taking this ancient technique and giving it a scientific boost.
Exactly. And it helps address climate change, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah.
Are there other collaborations like this in other areas?
Oh, yeah, all over the place.
Yeah.
In water management, we're seeing projects combining those traditional water harvesting techniques with modern engineering, like those ancient systems for catching and storing rainwater.
Yeah.
Now they're being studied and improved with scientific data and new materials.
So it's like taking the best of both worlds.
Exactly. You got the wisdom of the past and the tools of the present.
That's really neat.
Yeah.
What about forest management?
Oh, that's another great example.
We talked about how important trees are in these practices.
Right. Well, indigenous communities have long used controlled burns to manage landscapes.
Yeah.
And now scientists are studying this using fire ecology principles. And it's giving us a better understanding of how those burns can reduce wildfire risks and, enhance biodiversity.
So they're combining that ancestral knowledge with modern tools
Exactly.
to manage it better. Are there any specific examples that come to mind?
Yeah, the Blackfeet Nation in Montana is doing some great work.
Okay.
They're partnering with scientists to restore wetlands on their reservation.
Wow.
It's this blend of traditional ecological knowledge and contemporary hydrology.
And wetlands are so important for the environment.
Oh, they're crucial. They act as natural filters and provide habitat for all sorts of species.
What's unique about this partnership, though?
Well, the Blackfeet people, they have this deep understanding of the plants and animals in those wetlands.
Right.
And all those traditional practices that kept them healthy.
Yeah.
And they're sharing that knowledge with scientists who are bringing their expertise in water flow and quality.
So it's a real exchange.
It is. And the project's been super successful so far.
Wow.
They've improved water quality, enhanced wildlife habitat, and even brought back some of those traditional practices that were connected to the wetlands.
That's amazing.
It really shows the power of blending different ways of knowing.
It's inspiring to see these collaborations creating positive change for both people and the planet.
It really is.
I mean, are there examples of this in energy and agriculture too?
Oh, absolutely. In energy, you've got this convergence of indigenous perspectives on nature and these modern renewable energy technologies. Think solar, wind, biomass, all connected to elements that indigenous cultures have honored for generations.
So it's like those ancient understandings are now informing how we develop energy systems.
That's a good way to put it. And it's not just about the technology itself.
Right.
How it's implemented. Indigenous communities are playing a big role in planning and managing these projects.
So they have a say in how it's done.
Yeah, they're shaping their own energy future. And in agriculture, we're seeing things like crop rotation, polyculture, agroforestry.
Right.
I mean, those are all regenerative agriculture.
Right.
And scientists are now studying these practices, using their tools to understand the science behind them and measure their impact.
So it's like taking these time-tested techniques and putting them under the microscope.
Exactly. And what they're finding is that a lot of these practices are not only sustainable,
Yeah.
but also super resilient and productive.
Yeah.
They're rediscovering all these ancient crop varieties that modern agriculture has kind of forgotten about. And these crops often have really valuable traits like resistance to pests and diseases and even climate change.
It's like unlocking this treasure trove of genetic diversity.
It really is.
That could be the key to a more sustainable and resilient food system.
Absolutely. So you see, it's all about recognizing the value of both indigenous knowledge and scientific understanding and finding those ways to blend them together.
It's so hopeful.
Yeah, it's a really exciting time. This movement towards collaboration and knowledge sharing is just getting bigger and bigger.
It gives me hope that we can create a world where these indigenous sustainability practices are not only preserved, but truly embraced and integrated into our societies.
I agree. I think we're headed in the right direction.
This has been a fantastic deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much about what sustainability really means and all the wisdom that these communities have to offer.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. And remember, this is just the beginning.
Right.
Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking questions.